Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff, you know? We're talking international humanitarian law.
IHL, the
Yeah,
laws of war.
right. And, this isn't just about, the history of this stuff. We're going deep on, like, what's happening right now, like how it's actually playing out in conflicts around the world. And, we'll even touch on what the future might hold for these pretty critical
Yeah,
rules.
it's really a fascinating but complex area. At its core, it's really all about trying to reduce the suffering caused by war,
Right.
protecting those who aren't fighting,
Right.
and like trying to set some limits on how wars are actually fought.
I think one of the most, crucial things for people to grasp right off the bat is the difference between, jus in bello and just ad bellum.
Hmm.
So IHL, it's really focused on jus in bello. So that's like, the conduct of war, right? Like once
Yeah.
the fighting has actually started, what are the rules?
Not really.
And it applies, to all sides, regardless of who started it. Just ad bellum, on the other hand, that's all about like, is it even legal to go to war in the first place?
Yeah.
Like, what are the reasons that are acceptable?
Ability.
That's a whole other, can of worms.
Yeah.
But IHL, it's like, okay, once the fighting's on, what are the rules of the game?
Yeah, and within that, we've got these two main types of conflict. International, which is usually like state versus state.
Right, the classic kind of war.
Yeah, the traditional kind.
Yeah.
But then you've also got non-international armed conflicts, which
Right.
can involve like, governments fighting non-state groups or even non-state groups fighting each other.
Yeah.
And it gets tricky because these can sometimes overlap in really complex ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's messy out there in the real world.
Very messy.
So, our sources lay out these core principles of IHL. These are like the foundations, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have humanity, which is basically, minimizing suffering.
Like avoiding unnecessary suffering
Mhm.
and, making warfare as humane as possible.
Right. And then kind of on the flip side, there's military necessity,
Hmm.
which is, using only the force that's necessary to achieve that military objective.
Right.
And then there's distinction, which is super important. That's all about making sure you know who are the civilians, who are the combatants.
Always distinguishing between those two
Yeah.
groups and
Right, right. And not targeting civilians. And then proportionality.
Mm-hmm.
This one always gets tricky. It's basically, making sure that the harm to civilians is not excessive, like way out of proportion to the military advantage you're trying to gain.
Right. And that's really subjective a lot of the time.
Totally. Yeah. Like, how do you even measure that?
Yeah, it's a constant point of debate.
Always. Yeah.
Oh.
And then finally, there's precautions, which is, basically taking active steps to try to avoid civilian harm.
Right.
So these 5 principles, they kind of work together, right? But sometimes there's tension between them.
Exactly.
Like, how do you balance, that military need with minimizing suffering?
Yeah, that's the constant struggle.
And what's fascinating, too, is even if there isn't a specific rule in a treaty for a situation, basic humanitarian principles should still apply.
Right. It's called the Martin's Clause.
Yeah, Martin's Clause.
Like a safety net.
Yeah, yeah. So, all of this sounds good in theory, right? But here's where it gets, really real. Recent conflicts have really tested IHL.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're seeing some worrying trends like, IHL being eroded or interpreted in ways that kind of, bend the rules.
Yeah, like people trying to find loopholes or justify actions that, maybe push the boundaries of what's acceptable.
Right.
And a lot of this has to do with the changing nature of warfare itself.
Yeah, and one of the biggest challenges, right, is protecting civilians in urban warfare.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly difficult because you have civilians and combatants all mixed together.
Yeah, they're right next to each other, right?
Right. And then you have this problem of dual-use infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Like a power plant could be used for both civilian and military purposes.
Right.
So how do you apply distinction? How do you make sure you're not hitting civilians when you're targeting something that might also have a military use?
And even if you're trying to be careful, those repeated attacks on cities, they have such devastating long-term effects.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It can take years, decades even, for a city to recover from that kind of damage.
Right. And then on top of all that, we have all these new technologies that are just, changing the game completely.
Yeah, like autonomous weapons.
Oh, yeah, like killer robots.
Right. How do you ensure accountability when a machine is making life or death decisions?
Right. And can they even follow, those core principles like distinction, proportionality?
That's a huge question mark.
Huge, yeah. And then there's cyber. You
So
know,
cyber operations,
yeah,
yeah.
like what even counts as an attack in cyberspace?
Right.
And how do you protect civilian infrastructure and data in this, digital age?
And then there's the whole issue of attribution.
Yeah.
Like, if there's a cyber attack, how do you even know who's behind it?
It's like the Wild West out there.
It really is. And then you have information warfare, disinformation.
Oh, right. And that's not just about spreading lies, it's also about manipulating people,
Yeah, outstraight 'em.
inciting violence, undermining humanitarian efforts.
And even affecting civilian decision-making.
It's just a whole other layer of complexity.
Absolutely.
And the thing is, IHL, it was developed in a different time
Yeah,
for more traditional types of warfare.
right.
So there's some real questions about how well equipped it is to deal with all of these new challenges.
Right. And then there's just the fact that, IHL is only as good as the respect it's given.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of, blatant disregard for it out there.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And then these, gray zones of conflict where it's not always clear if it's war or peace.
Right, hybrid warfare.
Makes it really hard to apply IHL.
Definitely.
And then you have the whole issue of, detainee protection, the actions of non-state actors. I mean, it's a lot.
It is a lot. So our sources, they take a close look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as kind of a case study.
Yeah, that's a really good example of how these issues play out in the real world.
Yeah, so IHL, including the Geneva Conventions, it applies to all sides in that conflict.
Right.
Even though the status of Gaza is disputed, the rules of armed conflict are still relevant.
Exactly.
And there have been some serious allegations against Israel.
Yeah, like disproportionate attacks, civilian casualties,
Damage to hospitals, schools, places that are supposed to be protected.
And they often justify it by saying these are dual-use targets.
Right, like they were being used by, Hamas or something.
Yeah, and there have been concerns about collective punishment, like cutting off supplies, restricting aid.
The use of white phosphorus has also been controversial.
Mm-hmm. And then there are the allegations about mistreatment of detainees, targeting medical personnel,
Spreading disinformation.
A lot of international organizations and even governments like the UK have raised concerns about, essential supplies being blocked or restricted.
But Israel, they argue that their actions are in line with IHL.
Right. They say they're doing what they have to do given the tactics of groups like Hamas.
Right, Hamas operating in civilian areas using human shields.
Yeah, so Israel says they're trying to strike this balance between military necessity and humanitarian concerns.
They also point to their efforts to notify civilians before attacks,
Right.
to minimize casualties, and they say they're acting in self-defense against Hamas attacks. They deny intentionally blocking aid. They say it's about security concerns, preventing Hamas from getting supplies, things like that.
Right.
But the thing is, it's just so hard to verify any of these claims because there's so much, conflicting information out there.
Yeah, the information environment is really contested.
It's a mess.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to look at the U.S. approach to IHL and all of this, right?
Yeah, because they're a major player on the world stage.
Totally.
So the U.S., they have ratified the Geneva Conventions,
Mm-hmm.
and they say they support a lot of IHL norms.
Yeah. And their military, they're supposed to follow the law of armed conflict in their operations.
Right.
And they invest, a lot in training and compliance.
Mm.
But they haven't actually ratified additional Protocol I.
Yeah, that's been a point of contention.
Big time, yeah.
Back when Reagan was president, he rejected it. He said it was fundamentally flawed.
And too favorable to, quote, terrorists.
Right.
So the U.S. had a bunch of concerns about it.
Like Article 1.4,
Yeah.
which deals with self-determination conflicts. They were worried about, legitimizing terrorism.
And Article 443, that one's about combatant status.
Right. They felt like it blurred the lines between combatants and civilians and could put civilians at risk.
And they were worried about the restrictions it placed on attacking military targets.
Mm-hmm.
They felt like it could create a lot of ambiguity for military operations.
And they were concerned about the provisions on reprisals and nuclear weapons.
So it just wasn't something they were willing to sign on to.
Right.
They also didn't ratify Additional Protocol 2. They thought the scope was too narrow.
But they did become a party to Additional Protocol 3.
The one about the red crystal.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, right? Because even though the U.S. hasn't ratified Additional Protocol I, they still often follow a lot of its key principles.
Right. Like they consider Article 75, which deals with the treatment of detainees, to be applicable.
Mm-hmm.
And they try to incorporate the positive aspects of Protocol I into customary international law.
Right.
And they often go above and beyond Protocol I in terms of protecting civilians.
Yeah, they kind of set their own higher standards.
Right.
And they're big on promoting IHL training for other countries.
hmm
They share their legal interpretations.
Yeah, so it's kind of a pragmatic approach.
hmm
Like, they're willing to adopt the parts they agree with without being bound by the treaty itself.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really interesting.
And, it highlights these challenges of trying to keep IHL relevant, in this constantly evolving world of conflict.
Absolutely.
So looking ahead, where do we go from here? What's the future of IHL?
Well, it's clear that IHL needs to adapt.
Yeah, I can't just stay stuck in the past.
Right. So there's talk of reinterpreting existing rules,
Yeah.
clarifying how they apply to new situations.
Right.
And customary international law, that's where state practice and legal opinion come together to form new rules. That could play a big role.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there are soft law instruments. Those aren't legally binding, but they can still influence state behavior.
And norm entrepreneurship, where leading states kind of set the example and push for new standards.
Exactly.
And then there's, the need for better implementation and compliance at the national level.
Right. States need to actually put these rules into practice.
Yeah, walk the walk.
Exactly.
And international dialogue is crucial, like the discussions the EU is having about unmanned weapons. And there might be a need for some new treaties, like one specifically on lethal autonomous weapon systems.
Right. To address that really specific challenge.
Yeah. And finding ways to engage non-state actors, to get them to respect IHL.
Absolutely.
And clarifying the legal framework for these gray zone conflicts.
Yeah, figuring out how IHL applies in those situations where it's not clear if it's war or peace.
Right. It's a lot.
It is.
But, international organizations, they have such a huge role to play in all of this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The ICRC, the UN, international criminal courts and tribunals, parliamentary organizations, they're all really important.
Yeah.
They help to shape the development of IHL. They monitor compliance. They try to hold violators accountable.
Right, they keep the pressure on.
Exactly.
So I think the big question is, is IHL actually effective? Like, is it really making a difference?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, experts have different opinions on that.
Yeah.
But I think there's a broad agreement that IHL is still important.
It's the best system we've got, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the framework we have for trying to regulate warfare, for trying to protect people. But there are some real risks to its effectiveness.
Mike.
Well, there's this declining commitment to IHL from some states.
Yeah, some countries just don't seem to care.
And then there's misapplication of the rules. People twisting them to justify their actions.
Right, finding loopholes.
And sometimes violations are just overlooked or ignored.
And there can be biases, in how the rules are applied or enforced.
Absolutely.
And then there's just the sheer speed of technological change.
Yeah, IHL is struggling to keep up with that.
It's always playing catch up.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a mixed bag.
It is.
IHL is important, but it's facing some serious challenges.
Right.
So I guess what we need is, stronger political will to actually uphold these rules, more accountability for violations,
Definitely.
and better international cooperation.
Yes, states need to work together to strengthen IHL and to adapt it to the changing nature of warfare.
Right.
It's the only way to make sure it stays relevant and effective in the years to come.
Yeah, it's a huge task.
It is, but it's a vital one.
Totally. So for those of you listening, think about this. Considering how fast technology is developing and how warfare itself is changing, what do you think is the most important thing about IHL that needs to be strengthened or maybe even completely reimagined?
What needs to change to make sure it can actually protect people in the wars of the future?
That's something for you to ponder. Thanks for diving deep with us.
Thanks for listening.